So this is the first of several or many conversations that we'll have for the Seoul Biennale International Studios. And we have a lot of amazing studios visiting us from abroad, but also, of course, local institutions that we're partnering with. And we are in a way the sort of the ground troops of the Seoul Biennale. We're in a privileged position because we're actually the first groups, the international studios are the first groups to actually come in and do intensive research on Seoul. So in a way, imminent was a word that we, Hyungmin will talk more about it, but it's a word that we threw around for a while to really capture the kind of impending, almost doomful aspect of the commons in crisis in a way, questioning the commons, reinventing the commons. So I just want to give a brief sort of summary of the international studios, what it is, why we're here. The same there'll be kind of live projects and exhibition spaces. We will do speculative research, and these are some of the sites we're working on. Immediately around Dongdaemun, Changsindong, where there's a lot of production going on, the Ulchiro area. And instead of going to the West Gate, next semester there'll be some research happening near Seoul Station. And one of the big questions is, are we now at the end of the Anthropocene? If you guys, just to define Anthropocene, it's the global impact of human activity on this earth. And we've always framed our cities with humans at the kind of pyramidal apex. And sometimes we think that's good, human-centered cities, why isn't that good? But actually it's paradoxically maybe not the way to conceive of cities. So another way to think of this, and this is just a little ideogram, is what if there's a horizontal relationship instead of a hierarchical one? And these are really the themes, the 10 themes of the Biennale. Describing our sites is the difference between monolithic and fixed, but this is very similar to Dongdaemun. The reason why Namdaemun market has in a way declined is because one controlling entity has administered it. And so it actually doesn't have the nimble qualities that Dongdaemun has. Dongdaemun, most of the factories are 3, 4, 5 people, less than 10. And so these micro production, another theme that we're going to hear about today, actually allows these swarms to reconfigure.
Hello everybody, I'm Hyungmin, and welcome. And the background of the Biennale, the existence of the Biennale can be explained by a recent shift of policy from the Seoul Metropolitan Government. After the 07-08 global economic crisis, after decades of development-oriented policies, the government has shifted to more sustainable horizontal governance systems. In terms of architectural projects, they are smaller projects that are spread out all over the city. You may have seen some of them. And so this is a very new kind of urban and architectural initiative, and the Biennale is, of course, part of that. The Commons is not a new phenomena. It is now a very, very prevalent issue, mostly in the economy, in the way that communities are organizing themselves. And so it is even not imminent. And we find when we walk around the streets of Seoul, and to any other major city, we discover that we are actually late, quite late. That Commons, of course, is a Western, it's an English term. So people who have lived in Boston all know the Boston Common, which is, of course, a park right now. But the way it was set up was that British settlers came in and sort of enacting their old medieval system. They had this sort of green area that was commonly used for cow grazing. But of course, through modernization, the common became what is sometimes considered the first public park in the modern era. The issue of the tragedy of the commons. So we have the common grazing ground, and so individual, whether they have private ownership of the cows, come and commonly graze. But individuals with their own reasonable private interest want to have more cows. There is only two alternatives for the issue of the commons. Either you have a totally communistic society where there's no private ownership, and then in the private system, you would assume that everybody is just private ownership, and whatever is shared would only be run through the public governmental systems. But the nature of space, urban space, is that the more you use it, actually, unlike the grazing ground, the more people use it, actually it becomes even more valuable. It enhances its quality. And so, though the term commons is a Western idea, it is prevalent in both East and West. So in the Korean tradition, you can talk about the common spaces within Hanok, within the villages, that were again not privately owned. And so there is a kind of tradition that I still think that exists in places like Dongdaemun, that is very, very cultural, that is intensely used. It has a kind of mixture of modern, pre-modern, and also post-human, as we were talking. And so the point I think I would like to make is that we are dealing with a kind of synthetic phenomena. So the commons is not a thing. I think John really made the essential point that it is an activity, it is a process, and that everything is not really clearly connected, but it has a totality of relations that I think.
We're also looking at the Pengbeng market and looking how we can generate urban renewal through adapted reuse. This coming from a trend that's been occurring in, we can see international competitions happening in Seoul, Jooeun Sung, with the city as a place of making, sensing, recycling, connecting, and archiving, therefore can be thought of as a new kind of commons that has spatial consequences transversely connected to social and political reforms. And the reason why I kept this one and I like it, and I'm trying to frame the studio in this way, is because it makes me ask, can a building be operative to the urban fabric? So I believe it can be operative. It can operate within an industry or for an industry, as well as it can operate as an infrastructure. Can we revolutionize or revamp an industry, the hybrid industry? Can we take, for example, top industries that generate the most of the GDP in Korea or Seoul? How through merging these we can start changing the localized environments, in a way brings Seoul to the world stage, not as a competition of staying within what could be designed as fashion design, with couture houses of London, Milan, Paris, New York, but it actually thinks of itself more in this way. What are the new technologies? And it's not competing with global cities. And they pick these cities because of institutions where they can merge research and development and technologies with industries of garments and fabrics. Again, this is from the MIT Media Lab, which I don't know if, John, you have one of these or not, but maybe operative, just like there's opera buildings, operative clothing.
And bringing Washington University in China, actually in St. Louis, students. But you, when you see my students, you know what I'm saying. That the housing typologies are very much engaged with industries. So whenever there's a new industrial revolution, the new housing typologies were proposed. Two important revolutions have happened. One is the technology, and secondly, basically how to sell it. But now you have all those internet platforms that you can just put your stuff online, and all these 3D printing, all these things have become fatigue in the conversations of architecture. But at the same time, we haven't actually talked about how these new technologies or new ways of making things will change our lifestyle as well as housing typologies. And in socialist city, you see these the idea of having production facilities with the housing, so that people in your neighborhood make something for the neighborhood. So that's called as a micro district. But as we know that the socialist cities wanted to be the cities of production, not just the cities of consumptions, which is why they also put production facilities along with the housing.
And we know that the default form of urban change in Seoul is the renovation of inner city residential quarters through the so-called joint redevelopment. It's a system which is based on a voluntary contract between property owners, residents associations, and developers, and it relies heavily on the expectation of economic profit to be obtained with a difference between what is built and what could be built. Up until the recent crisis of the model has forced the revision of many of these areas. So when Mayor Park Won-soo was elected, he settled to revise many of these areas for renewal, and up until 2015, 245 of those areas proposed for renewal have been cancelled. What should be the paradigm for urban change in Seoul specific to its unique conditions today? For the purpose of the studio, we're proposing to use the idea of metabolizing. In the 60s, metabolism as a noun emerged as the first truly Asian modern manifesto about architecture in the city, although it was a very megalomaniac vision of continuous renewal of its functional components. So what we're proposing here is to use metabolizing Seoul as a verb, recognizing the city as an urban assemblage of isolated buildings or grains that are in constant stage of change and in order to cater to daily life. So within this context, city making would be about the stewardship of the constant urban change.
We chose the title Traversal City because when we looked at Dongdaemun, we conceived it as many layers of linear boundaries and linear layers. So we thought traversing the layers as tactics for exploring the city. And traversing applies not only to traversing the physical boundaries, but also to more like social and environmental layers as well. The Dongdaemun area is almost empty from the old maps, which means right now, compared to areas around Dongdaemun and the Dongdaemun Wholesale District, where most of the surrounding areas are quite dense, and it has the existing urban fabric, well connected. The area that we are in searching for is mostly it's supposed to be the largest wholesale fashion district in Asia, and you can see it almost like an archipelago of megastructures. So it's probably conceived with a top-down development model, which somehow is failing at this time. Next. And when you look at the area, a particular building caught our attention, which is the Pyeonghwa Market, the linear structure, which sometimes appears as a wall, but then it has this visual metaphor of becoming a possible connector. So it was also historically and symbolically important because, and it all developed with some kind of a promise on unlimited horizontal expansion, and you can see that it created many layers horizontally and also vertically. So there are horizontal layers and vertical layers that expanded the existing market to unlimited possibility. The early 60s is probably the typical content architecture that both Jorge and I are very fascinated about. It's basically a building that is a structure. It's more like an infrastructure where it can be filled in with, not designed for any specific programs, but is there to provide space for whatever programs to come in. And as you can see from this old Pyeonghwa building, if you compare it with what it is now, you can see that the windows are much larger. It only shows the frames. So it's basically a frame and infill structure. That's how we understood the nature of this building. Next. And it being a frame and infill means that it can be filled up with anything. And at that time, there were many things happening commonly in that site. Fabrication, living quarters, sweatshops. It may have multiplied the market area, but the opportunity for this vertical connection was lost from the beginning. Because the market structure has gone up, elevated, and duplicated, now the interior corridor has become the shop front. Next. And the exterior surface became the back of house. So basically, this content architecture became a wholesale warehouse. It's a warehouse where it has a 600-meter long corridor, only 90 centimeters wide. It's the only circulation in that building, basically a tunnel structure. Even with the public activity introduced, it is still isolated in a linear form because of the sectional differences. Once you're down there, it's like a trench. You cannot get out until you walk 600 meters. Same. The last one I'm going to address about the imminent changes are the internet shopping that kind of creates a new breed of jobs in the area. You will see these guys running around with plastic bags if you go there from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. And next. They are called 사입자 or 사입 삼촌. They traverse through more freely from any architectural restraints. And it's a perfect example of how this non-architectural auxiliary network can cover up for what architecture fails to provide.
One thing is about the issue of smallness. You know, I think the Dongdaemun now is really about bigness in a sense. So this is a kind of, and there is a whole theory of bigness related to Kolkhas and to the neoliberal city. So I think from my point of view, what we can find not in Dongdaemun but in the areas around Dongdaemun is this issue of, let's say, maybe some people could say it as a pre-modern condition, but I would say it's an opportunity as a critique of a neoliberal city. The small scale existence there could be a suggestion that we could mobilize and kind of use in order to suggest future scenarios. And the other one is the presence of expandable interfaces. Instead of having that kind of introverted interfaces, we can see that in Seoul, in Korea, there is a very kind of soft interface between public and private that can be adapted to winter, to summer. We also found, it seems that it's not so traditional, but we found just randomly, like a kind of in a derive through Seoul, this kind of reverse boundaries in which what should be in this case is a bar counter, which should be usually in the interior space. Now it was reversed, and you see this was 2 days ago. It was quite rainy, but still the people were there. So it's a kind of acceptance and enjoyment of outside conditions, even if they are competition. This word that mixes competition and cooperation. So all of small shops run by individuals, which are clustered, and by being clustered and maybe acting as a dynamic swarm, as John was mentioning, they survive in a very interesting and definitely very kind of surprising way. Next. We can see that also facades sometimes are just the activities, but at the end is this concept of not having putting the backstage in the front and putting the activities in the front.
Was that in the opening sentence there's this amazing quotation by Italo Calvino, and he's writing about the fact that it's the everyday city. The topic that we're looking at is the residual, and we don't have any work on Seoul because we've just come here, but we have some thoughts that we are bringing from Hong Kong. And in many terms, you all know Hong Kong, I'm sure, but it's an accidental city. I think it was never meant to be. And in many ways, it's high density, but it's an extremely engineered city. And what you see here is a map showing the reclaimed land since 1905. And what comes with this engineering city is a byproduct. These residual spaces are like ready-mades, that they are just waiting to be plugged in, and then it could generate another meaning. Over a year and a half now, we've been cataloging these conditions. So we have more than 150 of these residual conditions. And the important fact is that they're not designed. They just happen and people appropriate them. And I think by drawing them, you can kind of try to understand how they all work, how the elements work together. And these residual spaces could be used in terms of reactivating some of the existing trades or trades that are lost in these residual conditions. trades like printing, like sewing and textiles, and also seeing how these trades are changing. And so how clothes are made now is very different from how they used to be made with the...
Sometimes, some areas, the product is more important than process. In the other areas, the process is more focused on than product. So that we can a little bit, selectively choose which way we have to focus on. So we are kind of out of a, material production age, and then we are kind of sort of in the intellectual production age. In the material production age, we always, end up with the garbages. But in the intellectual production age, like this age, but we are not using body anymore. So only the human beings are only species that they want to be a machine. They want to kind of, hybrid with the machines. So that, the concept of, the life of human being, I think will be changed. When you look at the, this, avatar, human bodies kind of extended through the, robot. The city should be kind of boost this kind of, features so that, city of walkability, hikeability, bikeability. The city has to be, evolved to utilize the, the use of human bodies together with a little bit machinic, hybridizations.
So that means that the whole need for transport, for mobility could change if we address it as planners and architects in an appropriate way. And that also refers to what we learned today during your presentations regarding the use of space. So how we distribute living, recreation, sleeping, housing, working in the city. So I mean, in the past we said IT will change our way to work. In some companies, in some countries that works better, in some not. So that means that it's also society, the question of the society.
Every professor and student probably will have a dilemma that do we need to try to keep the smallness or the oldness or the traditional things or the slow master making of Dongdaemun and Ujiro area, or we are fully 100% or 200% adapting tech-savvy Korean technology into this development. And then the last thing is I probably want to make a recommendation to our coordinator, Professor Hong, is because we're hearing like really nice word, new vocabulary that each professor are proposing, or I'm assuming each students are also proposed to the professor. So maybe it'll be, this is a really good opportunity. I think this is the best way to collecting all the data. So it will be better that maybe we will have a big data or the SBIS vocabulary book coming out of all this 10 or 11 studio coming from all over the world. Maybe
the full comment production is moving to Vietnam for the lower wage, and it's just better for money making. So now we are asking like how to attract young people, and then it's a question of also how to move forward to the new way of making, that we can bring participation of the young people and young generation.
I want to second the idea of collecting the terms, the terminology that's come up, and I think there should be a glossary of terms, because I think that the number of really interesting ideas that are embedded in those terms is a direction for a new kind of urbanism. Bringing Hong Kong to Seoul and that observation and how that overlays and how we could read a city through another city, those methods. And so there's this atlas that I'm imagining has, glossary, concepts, methods of this. And it's all pointing to me to a kind of multifaceted manifesto. not the Athens Charter, not the La Saraz Declaration, 1928, those of the CM, but a new kind of manifesto for the complexity of the modern metropolis. We're not
first thing, I think that I better understand what Professor Hyungmin means by the notion of commons much more than before, and I think it has a great potential to be very, let's say, in simple word, deep and critical. That it also could engage with the notions of political and economic and perhaps social issues, right? An era of 재개발 is kind of losing its historical phenomena. And 재개발, by the way, is I think is actually internationally the most unique economic, social, political history ever. There's no other cities and countries that people have contributed their own properties individually and to develop a massive area at one time, and almost the whole nation profited for about 30 years.
And so, as the director, I'm sort of thinking, how will this become an exhibition? This is John's work. But I think we are in the midst. We are together with leading teachers, and I think I understand that you have all been doing, at least maybe in the past decade, that you've been thinking about new forms of studios and studio presentations. That because I think the idea of the modernist project has long been dead, and that, but at the same time, SNU just went through the accreditation process, and this thing asks you to do projects. Like they are still in the modernist mode that architects do building projects, and I would think that the curatorial challenge specifically asks for us not to just show projects.
One of the commons I was arguing for, and it never made it into the list,
Was
archiving. Archiving is one of my favorites, because in my mind, archiving and mapping is actually a catalyst for change. It's not something that you put in a drawer. It's something that you look at over and over again. And so I'm recommending our studios to take two actions. One is imminent analysis. You're right. We shouldn't just design buildings. That era is actually over.
To touch upon maybe a point of self-criticism towards myself and also towards architects. And I learned this through speaking to anthropologists. I think as architects, we're obsessed with the future. Obsessed. Always is a better tomorrow, a better vision, improve society, improve air quality. But we forget the here and now. And I think the essence of this Biennale is imminent. Imminent is so close to the here and now. And I think if we set upon the visions where we want a better tomorrow, we've fallen in the trap of the modernists. And we're not giving time to the here and now. And I think this is one of the places, Seoul, which has potentially one of the most vibrant here and nows that I know.
And then also, I think we have a danger of making these distinctions between smallness and bigness, I think. But for example, Zara and the shop in Dongdaemun are intricately linked, actually. Maybe they have a different aspects, but logistically, they are intrinsically linked. And so we have to actually capture that.
I'm also really fascinated by the glossary idea, and that is true that there's many kind of terminologies. Neoliberal urban condition or neoliberal city that was mentioned, and I think it was you, Jorge, who was talking about it. That, for me, it has been talked about so much, but then, how does it apply into the reality that you analyzed? For instance, how does it differ from what we would so-call the hipster sort of change throughout several areas that you were mentioning?
I wanted to introduce this term, the neoliberal urbanism, probably because, well, I think we can see it in all the cities, but in in Tokyo, especially coming with the Olympics very soon, it's so present. So it's basically this idea. I mean, in the functionalist city, still you had the government planning, but what we have now is that the governments are becoming smaller and smaller, and they are really outsourcing planning. Planning activity itself and public space is being privatized. And you can see it in Tokyo. And I think it's interesting to bring it here because it's interesting that this event itself is a kind of anti-neoliberal kind of approach. It's not happening in most of the cities that I know. Not in New York, not in Tokyo. I mean, this is happening. This is very special, I think. I really think what is happening now is really special. And you mentioned the hipster kind of approach. And yeah, I must admit that maybe this kind of point of view that we are bringing it can provoke this hipster kind of effect of gentrification. So that's the problem. I mean, once you find value in their everyday life, it brings economic value, and then it starts changing the city and gentrifying it.
So the development changed. Until 1990s, many people lived in Seoul and moved into Seoul in the morning of the weekday. Now, more people live inside Seoul and move out of Seoul in the morning of weekday. No? It means that Seoul was once an industrial hub, economic hub. Now, Seoul is a cultural hub, residential hub. The character of Seoul is changing. I heard that New York's #1 industry is tourism.
I would say that in terms of the production of the work, it's quite powerful because you're presenting almost like an alibi. Here is diagrams and charts of things on site as I've recorded them that produce a very powerful logistic, right? There's far too many bike deaths or bike accidents, right? Things like this, right? So it gives you the potential to say, here is what's missing in the scenario that we can fill, or here's how to ameliorate the situation that came. Between that and the design act lies the shadow. Right? If I can borrow a word from T.S. Eliot, right? Because otherwise, you're going to be looking at a certain level of willfulness anyway in terms of how you want to compose the complexion of the project, the layout.
The debate will go on, but the real question is, why do we do research? Or why do we have this crutch? And or for that matter, if we extend it to some of the curricular questions, why do we study history? Why do we study technology? I don't think there's such a thing as being a researcher for the sake of being a researcher, or doing art for art's sake. I think you're always pursuing something out of it. So in the sense that disciplinary expertise and training is because you actually have a project. Whether it's a political project, an aesthetic project, you have a project. Now, then research, there's no such thing as being objective and being pure to research, as the science fraternity would tell us.
would say there's more action, maybe even more culture and struggle in one block of Seoul than maybe in all of Singapore. No offense. But I guess I live there too, so I can say it. Yeah. So why is that so? I mean, why is that hunch so? What is the kind of ordering system, the logic, and the scaffolding here on the site? The kind of steam or vapor or energy that is here that flows across these rooftops and side alleys and staircases, from the butchers to the factories to the nonprofits to the joke bombs, and even to the small families sharing all of these facilities that kind of aggregate together and creates this kind of fantastic dynamic. So I kind of have two questions. The first is, how do we not fuck it up? Excuse my language. So my kind of deep suspicion is that architects, we can read and we can map and we can diagram and we can gain knowledge. But as soon as we start becoming architects rather than maybe geographers, we usually screw it up. The second question is that to participate in maybe the crafting of this future Seoul, it requires commitment, deep commitment and engagement. Even though I have some kind of personal connection to Seoul, my students and I are from a very far away place. So we parachute in for 5 days, and then we jump out. So how can 5 days be enough? Is that we try to start by drawing? Is that we just try to inculcate a kind of love for the place? And so to really understand a place and not to fuck it up, you have to love it. And so we tried to develop a more kind of nuanced understanding of the architectural form. And I think a lot of the data and kind of work processes that we just saw are fantastic. So we started with a 1 km by 1 km kind of sample in a way to just model out and make visual the kind of material scaffolding and not rely on the kind of Noli plan or the kind of typical abstraction, but to try to fill it up with as much detail and to dig in as deeply as possible. These all just come from Google Street View. Of course, when we came here, everything's wrong, but that was the point.
And I think some really ancient roots of our culture, the Asian culture, the philosophy, where we try to see the world as interdependent and interbeing, and how we could see this infusing the project of the city. So we were very interested in the palaces and the Hanok villages, where the idea of the family and the courtyard was an expression of the Confucianistic idea of the family structure, and how that replicated in a kind of fractal pattern, and as it grew larger and larger, it became palaces and then towns and cities. In Singapore, I think 50 years ago, when we tried to modernize, actually, we wiped clean all of these kind of informal settlements and informal relationships in favor of like parks, so we have industrial parks, residential. But today, what we were really happy to see that in Changsindong, we actually see the kind of expression of the network society that was almost predicted when the info age started, where there is a society based on relationships.
I like the idea of commons, but at the same time, it's too feel good. So I was trying to do something out of this. So if we understand commoning as a collective ownership and managing of resources, the very idea of the city itself is a common, is a collective physical and cultural creation by and for its inhabitants. The idea of uncommon commons forces us to look beyond the expectable material commons and to learn from the area in order to reevaluate its existing specific types of commons. So what are the social, political, emotional, psychological know-how commons that we could define and retool and redeploy in new ways?
The backdrop of a rejected New Town plan, I think very well said. We took that as really one of the markers of where cities are trying to go, but maybe in the wrong way. and the kind of local resistances, the multiplicity of opinions, the capacity of the city to somehow enable these very imprecise, sometimes I call them thresholds, the very fluid use. It clearly resists mapping. And we quickly understood that the kind of process of modernization in Seoul was very uneven. And if you like, this place of Changsindong could in fact benefit from what can be seen as a kind of delayed modernization. So,
and housing in the Asian city, Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, Seoul, being really the four Asian tiger economies, in which there's a shared history that between the 50s and the 70s, these cities have been very much built up from a manufacturing base, and they've all shifted towards a much more hybridized industrialization, post-industrial context. And it's interesting that Seoul remains very much still celebrating, and I think I said earlier that over 30% of its industry is still very much supported by these secondary manufacturing industries, whereas in Hong Kong that has almost completely shifted down south to Vietnam, out to China. But nevertheless, we're talking about cities that are both built upon production and also highly productive.
The majority of the proposal we're looking at small interventions, micro or chirurgical urbanism or strategic urbanism, pointed out a kind of a suspicion about a version of modernity that implies radical transformation of newness operating at the big scale, right? Kind of a form of anti-modernism, or kind of a suspicion of modernity that I think requires to be interrogated. Arriving to a place and having only a few days to understand it, some of the problems that it produces, or one of the issues that I find could have, is that you immediately fall in love. And a kind of a feel of nostalgia, a kind of an absolute certainty that what exists is okay, kind of emerges really quickly from some of the images. But I will kind of try to figure out how to problematize so much love that we have today. And I wonder if there is another way, another attitude that could be approached. But I think a lot of the descriptions, and there have been amazing descriptions of the site, point out a kind of a super complex ecology of relationships that not necessarily leads to a solution or a synthetic solution, but rather a kind of a series of controversies and productive disagreements almost, that I think could become the way to operate.
It is part of the modernist project to actually problematize and then create solutions. So we, as architects, we think that we can do this. At the same time, so your question, I love it. Just a little anecdote. One of the students from Upenn last semester, the title of their project was "Changga-chan, I love you, but you're toxic." You know, so it's about love. And their project was very interesting because the very problems of the site, they realized, were actually the solution. There was no separation between problem and solution. So you couldn't actually solve something without actually deleting the benefit of it. So
first I need to say I've now been in Seoul for 9.5 hours, so I've accumulated an incredible wisdom already. And I think there's something, though, about the discipline status and the anxiety about it in the studios that kept coming through. Then, of course, all the studios in some way started, of course, observing the place, and at a certain point, I think each of them, in a way, as my provocation would be, each of them started sort of stepping back from the discipline, like fearing we don't want to be the ones that are gentrifying. So, of course, the question is, well, what can we do? Because, of course, if you ask the question another way, what can we do and what can we do in a discipline that can redirect some of those decisions? And that's where the relationality stuff starts to come in. So from Australia, we're the worst new world poverty porn, you know. Isn't that a lovely favela where everyone's, you know, like, so in the end, it was interesting to hear colleagues from close by talk about the site in this way. How's the government starting to press back against an inevitable development paradigm? And having understood that as an architect, I then wonder, how can I enter that space?
I see promise and despair. I have both frustration and promise in what I've seen today. And the promise comes with statements like, maybe we do nothing. And I find that an incredibly radical, for us, proposition, and one that we should seriously contemplate. The critique that Aldo van Eyck did in the 1960s about dual thinking in Western thought. And so when you get something like Eric's proposition of the fuzzy boundary, I start to get excited because I'm thinking that's Van Eyck's orphanage project. It's all about degrees of blurring the boundary between inside and outside through very concrete means.
I really love the notion of the love today. I mean, that's the theme of the today. And we start to take pictures and start to walk around the Dongdaemun market and the Changsindong. And somehow we start to look at the people's eye. The people who lives in Changsindong they've been gone through like so much histories, like a Japanese period and a Korean War and all those economic crises, and they've been living there entire life, generation after generation. And even they had a chance to live in new town, somehow they rejected it. Do they love Changsindong, or are they happy? Do they need new solutions? I mean,
there's incredible momentum for the city government to begin to connect these areas into something that is both cultural, commercial, and productive at the same time. There seems to be a resurgent trend happening here where everyone is saying, yes, Seoul is like Guy Debord's psychogeography, a city of fragments. Also, people are beginning to reference collage city. I think these representations of our city, they're borrowed from the West without much critique, and there's a kind of exhilaration. You know that when we say we're so bad, we're good, looking at the condition of Seoul in this kind of trendy method actually is a very big disservice to actually what's going on. Here it is. It looks exactly like the station. Actually, it's a complete palimpsest because apparently it was a Swiss architect that designed this English station, and then now the same thing is built by the Japanese in Korea. So it has a very kind of conflicted, almost an angst-ridden kind of history. But that was when it was built. Look at it now. It's buried within tons of new infrastructure. This station is going to continue to expand. Since imminent connection is our theme today, it has completely divided two parts of the city. In terms of the local scale, what is that imminent connection? In May, end of May, I think, the first phase of the 7017 project is opening. And the promise of this, it was once a piece of car infrastructure, as you know, but the promise of this is to connect all these projects around the neighborhoods. So by 2030, this is a diagram by MRVDB, but unlike the High Line, which kind of maintains its status as a quote-unquote public park in the kind of American sense, opposite from that idea, the 7017 project will actually connect everywhere. It will be very promiscuous. It will crash into the third floors of buildings. And these are things that we should be very cognizant about. Its connection isn't always good. But we have this term in the U.S., good neighbors are made by good fences. Sometimes connections need to be much more strategic.
We are interested in to investigate the city not only about the physical structures, but also the social structure in that which makes and which complete the city. So, i.e., the people and the network of the people and the organization which makes the whole system work. Social sustainability is the keywords that I'm interested in. Actually, this is the lifespan of the building in each country, average. So in Korea, it's only 19 years. Do we not have enough technologies to make the building long-lasting? It's not. But it's more about the culture, and it's more about how we see the building architecture and city. But anyway, here, to make this city and architecture more sustainable, I want to say the architect is not the god. I think we all want to be an architect, and we are already architects, but we have to understand that we are not the person who makes the city, who changes and who direct the people. But actually there are more user groups, more different groups of the people who actually controls, who manage, who makes it possible, who change the systems, etc. So there are different kinds of people involved in the project that we have to understand, and that's the sort of the complexity that. Anyway, so the design, not the way things they look or the way they feel, but how they work and why they work. Expert citizen and citizen expert. So we, as educated architects and professionals, we are the expert citizen, but the community that we go in and talk is a citizen expert because they know a lot more about the area, they know every detail of what's going on, what's happened. We need two separate groups of the expert who needs to work together.